Well, thanks to all the contributors, and I have to say it's fascinating. All of your contributions are fascinating. I'm not really sure what my questions are because I have to absorb so much of what you've said, and I certainly, I think it's very interesting what you said about the ESRI, and really social justice as well said it, that when you take out the one-off measures, we've got a regressive budget. I agree with you, and I think that's a very important point for us to make. But yeah, I suppose my questions really resolve around the latter discussion, which is kind of the way forward, and what do we do with all these windfall revenues we have, and then that whole issue of FDI and moving away from reliance on FDI, and the two things are connected, aren't they? We have all these windfall revenues, and they're largely from the corporate tax receipts, which may disappear at some point. And yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a dilemma, isn't there? That because we need to invest them for long-term things, as Stephen is suggesting. Like, we have to invest in housing, that's self-evident, right? We haven't got enough housing. We have to invest in, I would say, public transport. That's pretty self-evident. We have to invest in both renewable energy, but also in retrofitting homes and making homes more energy efficient. Insulation, all that kind of stuff. I would argue something that isn't talked about enough is, and it's also potentially revenue generating, is we have to invest in a sustainable model of forestry. And that's also related to biodiversity, and one that is absolutely not talked about enough. I think we should be investing a hell of a lot more in arts. If we're talking about something that we could excel at a world level, in fact, that we do excel at, I think arts is always forgotten about as something, and you just think about what, how the world is dominated these days by, streaming, film streaming and gaming and, all sorts of essentially creative industries becoming ever more important. But we put pathetic amounts of money into the area of arts, even though we're generally held to excel in areas like literature, theatre, music, and so on. But we have very low levels of investment. But anyway, I mean, that's just a few thoughts, right? But in a lot of these areas, in order to do the things that we need to do, we are now having real shortages. Sorry, the health service. I forgot about the health service, right? We are having real shortages in the actual skilled people to do it, right? A lot of those things require engineers, architects, construction workers, and so on. We've got skills shortages appearing all over the place, and increasingly there are signs that young people who are qualifying in these areas are now leaving the country. So we're sort of in a vicious circle. We need the people who come out of college and who get qualified as, apprentices to do the long-term work to strategically reorientate the economy, but those people are leaving because we haven't done those things. Right? So I just wonder if people have any thoughts on those dilemmas, right? Because it's a bit of a catch-22 we're in. And indeed, you might say that, certainly, I mean, it's not the only thing. I mean, probably the cost of housing and accommodation is probably the biggest issue that would be cited by, say, people working in the health service who are thinking of leaving or who've actually left, right? And in a lot of areas. But also, at least in some cases, you've got to kind of increase current expenditure to keep them here. Do you know what I mean? Or in education itself, like, I think we should get rid of all financial barriers to education, because it makes sense for us that people get qualified. So why are we charging people fees? Why are we making it difficult for people to be graduates or postgraduates by charging them excessive amounts of money, or even not paying them to study, right? Because we need them. I mean, you know, one group I meet a lot is psychologists, for example. A lot of young people studying psychology now go to Holland, because in Holland you don't pay fees. Accommodation is cheap, and you basically are financially looked after studying, right? That's true. In Scotland, they pay people who are doing nurse training 10,000 quid a year to do it. Here we make them work free on placements, right? And so, you know what I mean? So anyway, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that dilemma, right? The sort of vicious circle, or the catch-22, of, in order to kind of have a long-term strategic focus to reconfigure the economy and to reduce our dependence on a potentially precarious FDI sector, but also then you need to kind of do things now to hold people here, the young people, the resource, the human resource that we have and that is necessary to do all those things. And just, sorry, one very last question is on the nationalisation sort of issue. I mean, isn't what you're saying essentially, is that an argument for a sort of, you know, state-driven industrial policy of, you know, I mean, I like the example of film, is we put a lot of money into film. We've been looking at the film tax credit at the moment, but we don't have any major companies of scale in film production in this country, right? Should we be doing that to build up an industry? Or, you know, actually the state sponsoring certain strategic industries in a big way, rather than just hoping the market is going to do it for us, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, those are my questions.
I don't know who wants to come in there. Ms. Bennett.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think, just in response to the Deputy's many comments, I think a lot of them are interrelated. So you mentioned, you know, the need to invest in infrastructure, and we would very much be behind that. While we have these windfall taxes, we need a long-term investment plan for those, so that what we do invest in is going to sustain us into the future. And certainly housing would be top of the list, because again, we're seeing, or we're certainly hearing stories of teachers and healthcare professionals who are leaving city centres because they just can't afford it anymore. And whether they're moving down the country or they're moving out of the country altogether, we can't afford that kind of brain drain, essentially. We rank 41st out of 63 countries in the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking. So again, that feeds into what Professor Kinsella was talking about in terms of, you know, how do we protect the relationship with multinationals while also moving towards our goals in relation to the upcoming white paper on enterprise, in relation to building up the capacity of our indigenous enterprises, and we certainly need to do all of that. In terms of the health services, and in both capital and current expenditure, and Dr. Healy mentioned it earlier, there's just a complete lack of transparency when it comes to the budget. IFAC estimates that we need 900 million, is that right? Just to stand still in terms of our ELS, our existing levels of service. So when we talk about increases in the health budget of 1.2 billion, that's really not the increase it appears to be, when the majority of that is just to safeguard the existing levels of service. In relation to the artists, and certainly, you know, there were some moves in relation to the pilot in terms of basic income, and we have plenty to say on that, as I'm sure you'd be aware. In terms of that for artists, it's very welcome for those who it will support, those 2,000 artists. But unfortunately, we're closing down artistic spaces. It's back to the infrastructure. So we're building hotels, we're closing down theatres and nightclubs, and, you know, all of those cultural spaces that we desperately need. So certainly in terms of, you know, what we need to move away from those regressive measures. We need to build in our infrastructure, and we need to plan properly into the future.
Ms. Dorley, do you want to come in?
Just a couple of remarks on that. So, Deputy, you mentioned the corporation tax receipts, and in all truth, where would we have been over the last few years and the last few crises without them? And it was great to have that money in the bank to be able to respond to the COVID crisis, to be able to respond to the cost of living crisis, to be able to pay these one-off payments. But as you rightly say, we have lots of challenges coming up that are long-term in nature. And I mean, the answer to some of this is going to be to spend more money in order to build more houses, to reorientate our economy, or whatever it is. And we can't rely on corporation tax receipt for that. So one facet of this has to be a look at the Commission on Taxation and Welfare's report, and what can we do, what measures in that report make sense to implement for now in order to raise more money in a sustainable sort of medium to long-term way. You had a really long list of challenges that we face. I'd add childcare to that, things we need to spend money on. And so you mentioned that, you know, we should be reducing access to education, but also in the early years, access to available, affordable, good quality childcare already starts to reduce inequalities and affords equality of opportunity to many children, which if it's left too late, they simply won't go to university, even if the barriers aren't there. So I would definitely add the childcare to the list.
Professor Kinsella, did you want to go in?
Yeah, simply to say that where state development has gone really well, and like just to, you know, again, I don't work for the guy, but just to plug Joe Studwell's book, How Asia Works, the thing that seems to have worked very well there is a key strategic focus by the state in saying, for example, we will develop the capability to produce extremely high quality steel. But we will do that for export. So that was the state. There was a state body mandated to help that work. There was oodles of cash allocated to do that. But it was the actual private sector that was put in place, the private sector firms that were put in place and allowed to grow a little bit, but also forced to compete internationally, that really got the thing working. So it was that kind of balance of state control in a certain sense, but also allowing these companies to fail where they obviously didn't meet the test of export markets. There's loads of examples of other countries, for example, the Philippines, where they tried this and they didn't allow failing companies to fail. And what happened was simply the creation of domestic oligarchs. And you really want to avoid that, especially for something as large as like the wind industry, because of course it's so big. There's so much money going to be involved in this thing. If you get it wrong, then the design of the system wrong, then you create huge pots of money, which will obviously create disproportionate amounts of economic power, and you know the deputies will be lobbied by those people into the future. And so you really want to create something like that. It can be privatized, whatever, later on down the road if the prevailing mood is there, but the key is the generation of a domestic capacity. It doesn't threaten the multinationals in any way. What it does is it says we're going to do this ourselves. We're going to put up with the inefficiency and the increased cost in the short term in order that we get greater efficiency and, most importantly, societal learning in the long run. So we become the place where you go if you have to know about wind power. This is exactly what is true for Denmark today. They started building up their capacity 40 years ago, and now they're the place to go when you want to build the stuff up. So if we wanted to, the easiest thing to do, probably the lowest level entry thing to do, would be to sort out the offshore planning, buy the turbines from Danish companies, have Danish companies install them, have Danish companies run them, and then they pay us some fee. That's fine, but no Irish companies are learning much about how this is done, and so therefore we're always the client. If you think about Ireland, it's kind of like an intellectual property warehouse. We kind of mined the intangible capital for the rest of the world. It would be much more satisfying and much more conducive to national economic progress if we were able to generate that intellectual property ourselves, have those ideas ourselves, and actually make it work. And it's that balance of the public and private, I think, that you need to really make that a big success.
Okay, I'm trying to bring in Deputy Healy-Rae as the next speaker, but Deputy Boyd Barrett, is there any follow-up you'd like to make?
Well, just on that last point, Stephen, are you concerned about the fact that most of the offshore wind that is being planned, from what I can see, is in the hands of private companies, and that there's a potential for us to be prey to people who are speculating in the area and have no real commitment to the welfare of the state or the long-term interests of the state.
Well, that's a possibility. If you get the contracting wrong, you're the state, you're contracting with a private entity. That private entity can essentially do what it likes. I think there's always a risk involved in that. But fundamentally, it's really about societal learning. Like if you're able to use this resource to figure out how to build the capacity yourself, then the nation, if you like, is insulated against the changes, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that happen. Things go bad, times change, technologies evolve, and all of a sudden it's 2009 and you're in Limerick and Dell is left. And now very happily for the people of Limerick, Dell have come back. There's actually more people working in that plant than there were before, but the people are different and the functions are different. One is, I'm not, well, I'm glad that they are back. It would be much better if we had our own domestic multinationals, because we would be able to I just believe that the workforce overall would just be better off if we were able to spread that knowledge around the domestic sector in a much more egalitarian way.